Right. I'd like to introduce Professor and Dr. Rob Gordon, who is our clinical psychologist this morning. He is vastly experienced in disaster recovery, working in the St Mary's, Black Saturday fires, and various other disasters, which we won't go through now. But Rob is going to explain to us, which I think you'll find interesting, about how communities are impacted, not just the citizens of those communities, and how we might endeavour to understand that and try and put the community back together, and in that process build our resilience. So I'll hand over to Rob now. Thank you very much, Rob.
Thanks, Peter. Good morning, everybody. As Peter mentioned, I started working with bushfires after Black Saturday when I was part of a children's hospital team, and visited the Macedon area for 4 years on a periodic basis. Halfway through that time, there was another very large fire in central Victoria around Maryborough. And so I found myself visiting two communities that were 2 years apart in their recovery. And that's when I started to get a sense that there were certain commonalities going on in the way the community process unfolded. And I thought there must be certain basic principles driving this, principles of the way human beings respond to trauma and stress. And that set me on the path of trying to develop an overall model that would guide us to understand what happens, how are things going to unfold, what can we predict, and more importantly, if these processes are predictable, they should be manageable. And so that led me to do something I hadn't been taught to do at university, and that was go away and read a lot about social theory and community processes and so on. And it shows me that what goes on in our mind is embedded in a larger community, and we have to understand this. So I want to present to you this, just in an outline way, the way in which we can predict any social unit is likely to respond when it is impacted, could be suddenly or could be slowly, like in a drought, with a intense, threatening and unusual event. I think the more we can understand these processes and recognize what's driving them, the better we can actually then manage the processes by what we do in the community. There's an American researcher called Daniel Aldrich, who's researched disasters, having lost everything he owned in the Hurricane Katrina. And what he's shown with very big studies up and down the coast of Japan and in all the areas affected by the East Asian tsunami, that the one factor that most accurately predicts not only the speed and adequacy and completeness of recovery, but also the death rate in the incident is not political influence, the amount of money spent on recovery or infrastructure, but social capital. The measure of the degree to which the community has established connections and groupings and self-help groups and information transmission groups on their own basis. That's the thing that most accurately predicts. And this is showing us that the essence of recovery is community process. And I want to try and provide some of the things I've learned about this in the last 30 years or so I've been working with this. Now I'm going to share my slides and we'll have a bit of time to discuss these after the presentation, but please feel free to raise questions as we go through. Now, I hope you can see that. Can everyone see that? I'll just have to work out which way it's going to show up when I put it onto display. Now, can someone tell me whether you're seeing the one slide or the two slides?
We're seeing two slides at the moment, Rob. It was
right.
was a little bit bigger in the previous.
So that should be the right way around.
That's got, yep,
Good.
Looks pretty good.
So if we start with the community before the disaster, communities are highly organised. And these dots represent the members, and the lines are the, let's call them the social bonds that connect them together. So this could be an area in which there are little towns, or within the town, it could be people that are grouped around particular interest groups, etc. Now these connections, these affiliations, if you like, in groupings, help to tell us who we are. And so we show this by the colouring. I'm sorry that disappeared so quickly, but it's a glitch that no one can seem to solve. So we got this sense that we've got all these different groupings, but that's only one dimension. Let's say that's a grouping showing political interest. But if you take another dimension, you'll find that you feel much closer to people in, let's say, a neighbouring town about climate action than you do to your next door neighbour who mightn't agree with it at all. And then we could take many other dimensions which all have their own organisation, in the sense that we fit together with those people that we feel something in common with, we interact with them, we feel closer to them around that issue, and we somehow learn to live in this complex multi-dimensional environment where we've got socioeconomic status, we've got occupation, we've got education, we've got political interests, religious views, cultural views, etc. And they're all interlocking, and somehow we get to know where people fit. There have been studies to show that if you map the way people understand their position in relation to various issues in the culture, and you do that across a whole group of people in a particular cultural group, they all have a remarkably similar mapping. In other words, we have a common picture of a culture. And so what I'd like to present to you is this idea that we've got a kind of multi-dimensional, let's call it something like a crystal lattice, that draws people into relationships and allows them to feel close to each other in some dimensions while being far apart in other dimensions. So that we've got this complex tapestry of connections in many dimensions. And where we feel far apart from community members in one dimension, we'll have a commonality in them in regard to other dimensions. And that's why the community holds together. And as long as those similarities and differences compensate for each other, we've got this sense of a functioning community. It's got its problems, but it holds together. Now, the fundamental organizer of this community is, through legislation and norms and customs and culture, is as best as possible to put survival off the agenda. In other words, I heard, I was on Southeast Radio, ABC, this morning doing an interview, and the item just before them was a bit of a discussion about a local bridge that needs to be replaced, and whoever it was from the local government, I think, was saying we'll be doing some work to prop it and repair it and make it safe until such time as we can plan and put in a new bridge, because the assumption is you can drive across that bridge without your safety being threatened. The function of communities is to put survival off the agenda, so people can go about their business without wondering, is this bridge going to collapse? Am I going to make it home tonight? When that fails, there are a lot of questions. There's a strong feeling that various people must have failed in their jobs if driving a truck over the bridge causes it to collapse. So that the stable structure and its rules and operations is to put survival off the agenda. We've got specialists to deal with survival: firefighters, police, doctors, plumbers, etc. And the rest of us can just get on with what we want to do. Now, here's the problem. A disaster, by definition, is something that brings a community-wide impact that confronts the members with survival here and now. We cannot delegate it to the designated people involved. We have to deal with the fire ourselves. Now that means we suddenly drop out of this complex web of relationships They are irrelevant. It's me and the fire. It's not that I won't help the people around me, anyone who's in my vicinity, but what will determine it is my physical contact with them. And evidence shows that we do much the same, whether it's our nearest and dearest or someone we've never met before. It's the physical opportunity that determines a lot of our behaviour. And so we have this sudden challenge to the community that cannot be dealt with in its normal processes. The only way that could happen is if the whole community functioned as an emergency service, but it doesn't, because normal life puts survival off the agenda. Now that means the bonds that we don't normally think about, the connections, the attachments, are irrelevant. The only thing that matters is the fire. And so here comes the fire. Here we've got on the left here, we've got the Liberal voters, and here's the Labor voters. And they don't like to talk to each other in normal circumstances. But as the fire comes through, they change colours. They all change to be orange because they're all not Liberal voters and Labor voters, but fire-threatened people. And here's the Collingwood barrackers and the Rabbitohs barrackers down here. And you see that as the fire comes through, it doesn't matter who you barrack for or what code you're in. And as the fire goes through, people actually do their best to survive given the immediate physical circumstances. And if you talk to people, and some of you may even have had this experience, as you go through it, everything condenses into the here and now. I live in a fire-threatened community from Black Saturday. We were surrounded by fire. And sitting there on the hill when it goes pitch black in the middle of the afternoon, you just feel keyed up, and the only thing that exists for you is the smoke. Can you see the flames? What will we have to do? And so on. Everyone sort of contracts. It's like the visibility is a picture of the social contraction, everyone into their own space. You wonder what might be happening, but you don't have any connection with people in other places. Now, I call this the moment of debonding. We debond from the connectedness to our social fabric because it is irrelevant, and we are in an extremely heightened state of arousal, and we are ready for anything. And that's what's shown by the dark red dots. We're all the same. We're not this complex multi-dimensional person with all sorts of interests. We're only one thing. We're a survivor. And that is an unstable state. We cannot function outside as a connected social unit. If you investigate the psychology of sects and of brainwashing, you can see that if you disconnect a person from their community and their families, they actually start to fall apart, and they have to bond to the sect or the captors in the case of brainwashing. And this becomes a very deep damage that takes a lot of work to change. And so this moment of debonding has the possibility of being destructive, but in normal communities, it stimulates an enormous rebound. Now, the important point about debonding is that it disrupts the sense of continuity, of connectedness, but it's unfamiliar. Therefore, it's neither recognized nor understood, because what it does is affect everything I normally take for granted without thinking about it. All the things that I don't consciously experience, but being my sense of place and value and identity. And in that state of heightened arousal, we are in an intense self-focus. And that self-focus, there's been a lot of research on this adrenaline state over the years, and you actually lose awareness of what you've lost because all of that attention goes into your relationship to the threat. And what I've learned through many bushfires throughout Australia and New Zealand and other disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, doesn't matter what you talk about, the psychological experience is the same, whether you're hiding in a room from a gunman or whether you're in a bathroom waiting for your house to blow down in a storm. And the important point is the reversal of this debonding is neither automatic, immediate, or complete. It requires a certain social environment to bring that about. And that's really what the task of rebound and recovery is. Now, it's an unstable state. It doesn't last long. To begin with, everybody comes together, but some people will probably leave the area, but those who stay will begin highly animated, intense communication with each other, where everybody's talking to each other about everything. Well, not actually about everything, only about the immediate circumstances of the disaster. And so what you see here is a social system that has lost the differentiation and organisation it had before, where I talked to this neighbour about football and that neighbour about politics and this neighbour about climate change, and we all got on well. But in this case, our life is very simple. It's who survived and who needs water and where are your horses and have you found your stock and so on. Where are you going to sleep tonight? So I call this the state of fusion, where all of that organisation has been lost, and you've got this sort of, instead of a crystal lattice, a plum pudding, and it's highly energised. And anyone who's been through this would know what the first day or two feels like. Now, what I notice is that, like any social system, that will rapidly form a boundary around it. And that boundary forms within hours already, days. And it's very important that the representatives of all the service providers are embedded in that fusion state as the boundary forms. Otherwise, they actually have to puncture the boundary in order to come in. And then they're experienced as foreign bodies. And I could give anecdotes about small communities where local government didn't make contact with them maybe for a few days or sometimes even longer, and expected them to come to the local area centre. And they actually form this cohesive unit and begin to look after themselves and feel a very strong animosity to the surrounding authorities. It's of course doomed because they can't supply for themselves, but there's this sense of we're forming our own identity. And the positive side of that is that people actually bond together to actually help each other. But it's a social system that is entirely devoted to the experience of the disaster. And you can see the different identities are starting to reform, but they're no longer in their organisation. No one's thinking about politics or climate change or anything else. They're just totally in the here and now. And so this fusion actually requires to be pulled apart to create the new multi-dimensional social fabric. I think of that as a process of social differentiation, so that the fusion is not the basis for the future. The new organisation that has the opportunity for closeness and difference and creative processes, that's the basis for the future. So that you've got what I think of as a process of differentiation required that will draw this plum pudding back into a complex structure. And for that, we need a transition process to a new sustainable structure that integrates old and new structures, serves recovery needs, focuses on being a new future. But now here's a really fundamental principle. What I've noticed and what I've gone away and read about is that there's a very strong finding in social theory and experimental psychology, which shows that if, you know, it's even there in rats. If you put too many rats in a cage, what do? They start to eat each other. If you have people in a social unit that is poorly differentiated, doesn't have enough boundaries or enough organisation, it's been known for years that the default way in which that organisation comes about is through conflict, hostility, antagonism, competition, and negative emotion. Unless we come in with an overarching organisational principle that helps people find out where they fit and how they come together. And in that plum pudding, we've got the seeds as time passes for conflict and negative emotion to open up. And this can be seen to start happening as soon as the differential impacts of the disaster starts to show up. In other words, the different ways in which people are affected. We all thought we were together, but hang on a second, I find you've been given a handout which I'm not eligible for, that you've been given a delivery of hay that I've missed out on. You've actually saved your house, I've lost mine, and so on and so on. Even two people have lost their houses. The house means something different to each person. One person has a new, well-insured house with new furniture. Another person has a small cottage that's been in their family for 3 generations, full of heirlooms. You cannot compare the experience. But we think we can in that state of heightened arousal. We're just looking at the external. So what happens is, I call them cleavage planes erupt. So here we can see the social bonds joining people here. And these people start to realize that actually these people have got some kind of grant that these people don't qualify for. Now, if we were all rational and calm, we'd say, oh, that's unfortunate. Yes, I can see that the terms of the grant allow you to get it, but I don't. No, that's not how it happens. And there's often in the plum pudding circulating of rumours about what people should get or shouldn't get, and whether they have been affected or whether they haven't been affected. No one really knows, but everyone's got a strong opinion. There are many problems with hay deliveries when people think somebody has been donated hay when they don't deserve it. In actual fact, nobody knows, but they bought the hay. And so once these gossip and rumours start to be transmitted along the communication lines, when the various people hear about it, they say, I'm deeply hurt, I'm not going to talk to that person again. And this ruptures the social fabric. By the same token, if we give aid in an insensitive way, it will separate people. We give it, it qualifies some people and disqualifies others, and it breeds resentment. And there are many stories where long-lasting feuds and bitterness exists because of what people got or they didn't get. So we can see that as time passes, the fusion is not adapted because it's based on the myth that we all have the same experience. And if we don't get in there and start organising very early, this process just keeps on going, and it goes on throughout the recovery if we're not careful, creating ruptures and cleavages and rifts, because its function is actually to produce a new differentiated social system in which we can find a place for ourselves. But it's doing it through destructive means. And this is one pathway of differentiation. So the cleavage planes have a function to differentiate groups from each other and help them find their position. It does according to the way the differences are perceived. It cuts across pre-existing structures because they're built on ordinary everyday life principles. It alienates subgroups from each other. They don't talk to each other. It fractures support systems. It impedes planning and decision making. We get a lot of cases where this has gone bad, where people don't want to sit in the same room with people that they're angry with. And so you can't actually start to work together. It politicizes what actually should be a psychosocial process. They go to politics or the media or whatever, and then things get embedded in the long-standing problems instead of the community coming together. So that I want to emphasize this because what I notice is that a lot of the irreversible damage that occurs to individuals, to families, to communities doesn't occur on the basis of what happened on the day of the disaster. It happens over the next months and years as these cleavage planes cut across and embitter people. And you can find this in case after case of disaster recovery throughout the literature. There's a lot of case studies in the United States and England from their various disasters that show how destructive this process is. But the principle is, if this need for psychosocial differentiation is managed through shared communication and changed structures adapted to the needs, the cleavage planes lose their function because we've got constructive processes helping people find out where they fit and why they didn't get this grant and how they can compensate for some other form of assistance. And the core of that is this idea of forming some kind of community-based advocacy group that then can begin to develop a disaster recovery communication system shown by these green lines. And this principle of community representation and advocacy is enshrined in the national recovery standards. Because if you think about it, normally governments of all sorts only provide very restricted assistance to their community members, and usually only small numbers of the community get any substantial assistance, because it's a principle of Western democracy that governments keep out of people's lives as much as they can. But after a disaster, they're going to need to be involved in a very intimate and complex way in people's lives for quite a while. And there's no basis in normal functioning of governments to do that. So we need additional feedback and attunement from the community. So the communities have to come together. So this is the Community Recovery Committee or the Community Resilience Committees. And hopefully the differently affected groups here have got together and have got a connection and a representative to advocate for their particular needs, so that all the various parts of the community get a say. And this recovery committee connects up and works with local government, state government on the whole redevelopment process. So it's finely attuned to the realistic experience and history and needs of the community. And that then leads us to the reforming of a complex, stable crystal lattice based on the new future. It'll be different, but it'll have to have some commonalities. So this constructive differentiation is supported by a few principles: community participation, validating emergent groups, new communication structures to serve recovery, a common fund of information that will constantly bring people to common ground over the cleavages, actively managing social tensions, inequalities, misunderstandings, because they will become a community event, and most of all, consistency in relief and assistance. Now, I've portrayed this as though it is a sequence of phases. Life isn't that tidy. It's a series of processes that spin off each other, but it doesn't go in a straight line, and the circumstances may mean that one community spends a long more time in cleavage than in differentiation, and another community gets onto the recovery committee quickly, and so the differentiation is more constructive. And when I've worked in drought affected communities and presented this, they've said to me, we recognise all these processes, but we see them all happening at the same time. And that leads me to this diagram, where you've got a kind of steady state. And if you follow this through, you can get copies of these slides. You can see that debonding will always lead to fusion, but if threats and survival needs come up in the fusion, people will return to debonding, and they can go from cleavage to debonding, and from cleavage to differentiation, and differentiation can break down to debonding, and so on. So you get this sense of lots of processes going on, and I think these ideas, for me anyway, provide a bit of a framework to map. If there's conflict, what's the issue? Is the issue related to the past history? Is it related to how recovery is being done or not done? It'll show a need that then can be thought about in terms of a constructive process. And so it's a steady state that comes and goes according to the circumstances. We have just a few basic principles. Preparation and planning reduce debonding. They won't eliminate it, or we wouldn't really have a disaster. The degree of debonding determines the degree of fusion. I've described it as though it's all or nothing. It's not. It's a whole range of shades of grey. The community may be very well prepared and barely debond at all. I think that's the case I've heard in cyclones in Western Australia, where they're very practiced. They've got all the buildings to codes, and they all just go and sit in a bathroom for a couple of days and then come out and start cleaning up. But you know that we're always going to get some kind of debonding for a while. The fusion is the major cause of the problem, not the debonding. It's the fusion, which is an unsustainable alternative social system. The cleavage planes are based on perceived collective differences, but information about what we have in common, our commonalities, in spite of the differences, sutures them up. And I've seen this happen in meetings where people have complained and been angry, and then somebody brings forward what we've got in common and why these differences are there and how we need to work together. And you can see the bonds start to form again. Circulating information promotes communication, which facilitates bonds, and common action creates constructive differentiation. And all of this has to be done through forming groups. Now, we can break this down, and I won't go through these points in detail. We can maybe ask questions about it. But we've got strategy 1, which is prevent or terminate the debonding. And in other words, bring people back into community as quickly as possible. The longer we have debonding, the more destructiveness is likely to occur. Second strategy, minimize fusion. And there are a series of simple strategies we can use to get in there early and help to rebuild organisation and structures and recognition of difference. Third, expect to intercept the cleavage planes. They will come. We need to constitute a community sense organ that will pick them up early and feed them into community groups that can start to think about how to manage them. And then get structures going and opportunities to meet so that we can stitch together the cleavage planes, suture them up by bringing people together in common experiences. Symbols and rituals are particularly important. And then finally, promote constructive differentiation right from the beginning, running through this. Now, in my last few minutes, I just want to say a few words about the role of arousal and stress in recovery. And I think this is very important because this is now talking about what's going on for the individuals in the middle of this process. The first basic principle is we have this graph that shows us something fundamental. Here's how well we function, our performance on this vertical axis. Here in the horizontal axis is how aroused we are. So we're not aroused at all. We may be depressed, or maybe a little bit more we're bored. And then as our arousal climbs, our performance climbs until we get into our comfort zone. And in this area, we kind of function on a day-to-day basis. We can use all our skills and do pretty well. But if the arousal keeps going, then we start to get into stress mode. And stress means I'm actually trying to deal with more than I can cope with. So I've got to actually shut some things out and put the focus on the things that are absolutely essential. And the higher the stress, the more demand is put on my system, the less I can hold everything together until we get right down here and we're getting to the point of trauma. Trauma means wound. And this is when the system's starting to break down. And finally, we get to the bottom where the arousal's so high we can't function at all. Now, if you take that principle, then what we find is the first state we go into is the emergency mode as the fire comes over the hill, which functions with adrenaline. And adrenaline floods us with reserves of energy and reorganizes us to focus on the here and now. It activates the right frontal lobe where I think in pictures. And so I have these flashbulb memories. We have very simple pre-programmed emotions, or in fact, we try just to go into action mode. Here's a picture of guys in adrenaline, rescuing a woman from a cinema fire. And if you look at this man's face, you can see the narrow focus of his attention on the task of evacuating. They haven't waited long enough to get this woman in a safe position. But if you have a look at the faces of all these men in adrenaline, this guy's got a lot of the effort, but you notice this blank expressionlessness in their face, intense, focused, but unexpressive faces. And that shows you that there's no emotion, it's all action. But if we were to stop them and prevent them carrying out their action, all of that arousal that's going into the action would suddenly feed back and convert into emotion, as it has for this bystander. And you get this relationship in this state of action versus emotion. And we know that when we're rushing around in adrenaline state and people try to stop us, we'll fly into a rage, or we'll burst into tears, or we'll be in this very emotional state. And so when people know what to do, they just go into overdrive. When they don't know what to do, they dither, they get confused and they can't plan. Now, that only suits the immediate threat situation. Once the fire's out and we've got somewhere to sleep that night and we've got things in hand, we move to the second state, which is a different state. It's the endurance mode. This is the state we go into, not when I've got an immediate problem, but when I've got a huge problem, but there's nothing I can do about it today to fix it up. Like, I can't rebuild my house this afternoon. In fact, I can't even fill out the form this afternoon because I haven't got it. I've got to wait for it to come, and so on. So we go into this state where we start to plod through, and this is the state that people are probably still in now, a lot of them, just going through the clearing up of their blocks and looking at how they're going to rebuild and what are their financial circumstances and how will they get building permits and the advice about what the BAL ratings are and so on and so forth. And so what we see is that people get into this plodding state. They can't do it in that right frontal lobe, just action mode. They've got to use the knowledge that is already there in their mind. But in this state, you can't solve new problems. You can't come up with new ideas. You tend to fall back on what's familiar. And there's the problem, that we haven't built houses after bushfires before. So we're trying to find our way through, but we're not in the right state. Here's a picture of I call it the cortisol endurance state. It's a different chemistry. These poor people have been held hostage by Filipino terrorists for 6 weeks. And you can see the similar blankness showing their high arousal, the intense brightness of the eyes, but there's nothing to look to. There's nothing to do. And if you have a look, there's a loss of the sort of implicit communication, the signaling that helps people keep in touch with each other. You can imagine that this married couple will probably need quite a bit of help with their relationship after they spent 6 weeks in this endurance mode. Well, it could be how a couple is in a farmhouse that's been burnt and they've lost all their fencing, etc., and they don't know how they're going to get through. We don't have, in this state, the leisure to be emotionally responsive. And so what I want to emphasize is that this is what's paralleling the cleavage planes in the social structure, is that this state of stress means everyone becomes egocentric, focused on my problems. And it's very hard not to feel that I need the help and to actually say, I better reach out and find out what's happening with somebody else. We all get too full. And so during this period of recovery, this is the state people are in for the longest time. And there are just a couple of points to notice about this. In this state of stress, our problem-solving thinking is reduced. Our ability for verbal thinking of concepts, planning, etc., lateral thinking is reduced. I'm going to jump to emotional associations rather than logical deductions. And that doesn't help me solve reality problems. It's very good for emergency survival, but it's not a basis for long-term planning and sustainability. Farmers have told me that decisions they made in the early period after the disaster, when they got a year or two down the track, they realized were poorly thought out and all that work had to be redone. At the same time, in this high stress state, we've got pre-programmed instinctive emotions going, and we don't have the complex, meaningful, socially organized emotions that allow us to have compassion and understanding and resignation and regret. And that keeps us all reactive and emotional. And of course, you can see how this feeds into the cleavage planes. And I'm going to react when I see somebody get some hay that I feel I should get, etc. And this leads to judgments. Now, there's just a couple more points I want to make before we bring it to a conclusion. But these are a simple set of principles about talking to stressed people. And whether this be neighbours or your partner after a bad day, or the service providers talking to community members, or working in informal support systems. I know that rural areas develop these peer support systems from one farmer to another. The basic principles are these. When you see a person's in this stress state, and you can hear it in the way they talk and their anger and their frustration, don't try and do any business before you bring their arousal down. Get them back up to the top of the curve. How do you do that? Just listen to them, be upset and angry and complain for a long time, and go with them. Help them. Instead of coming in and saying, look, that's not reasonable, ask them to clarify. Or how did you find out about that? Or where did that happen? Or do you know where the hay came from? Etc. And do it in a way that is slow and methodical and explains all the reasons, and you unpack your own thinking processes so that you lay out the logic with them, and pause between sentences so they can take in the new ideas. You know, instead of going with them and getting very excited like I am trying to get through all this stuff in a short time. And people have told me that it is so soothing to have someone talking quietly and calmly, even if you're yelling at them and they just keep talking back to you in a quiet way. It just slowly brings you out of it and you realize what you're doing. Now, because, and we don't have time to go into it, but we now understand what's going on in people's brains when they're in this high stress state. And the effect of cortisol and adrenaline to a different degree is to actually shut you out of the top left-hand corner of your brain. So you're operating in the right mode, where I can do anything that is familiar and I can visualize, but I just can't take in these big complex words and I can't think things out. You know, probably you've all had the experience of trying to fill out a form in unfamiliar language. Actually, people have a lot of trouble filling out the simplest forms in a relief centre after a bushfire, and they've just had a life-threatening experience. But it's the same for me. If you ask me to try and do my tax at the end of a busy day, I don't know what all the words mean, or a letter from an accountant. I can't make any sense of it because I can't get into the right part of the, I know it's in English, but I can't work out what it means, and I feel helpless. So they're using words that they don't think are jargon, but they're English words that they use in a particular way. I would use them in another way. So try and avoid any jargon. And I reckon the important guideline is, at about the age of 9, children start to work with concepts and reasoning and complex ideas. That's when they move from sums about apples and oranges to algebra. Remember algebra, A plus B equals C? They're concepts. So a good guideline to talk with stressed people, and you'd need to do that with me if you're going to talk about farming or accountancy on a bad day, talk to them using the complexity of language that you'd use to explain your ideas to an intelligent early primary school child. Don't talk down to them or treat them like a child, but just, it's a communication task. If you can put the simple words in, more sentences, unpack the reasoning, then people will understand it. Don't make assumptions. And then you start to build it up. And the difference between a person who's gone from one person to another and not been understood, and suddenly somebody's listening, they start to feel, I'm connecting. And that's the bond coming in. They'll form a bond to you. Now, just a couple of final points. One is the idea of resilience, which is bandied around. It's often bandied around in a way that I notice annoys people after disasters, because there's a simplistic notion that you should bounce back, you should just get on with it. But actually, when I followed this meaning of this word from the English dictionaries to the Latin dictionaries, and from the Latin to the basic idea behind the Latin idea to spring back, you come to this word sale, which means reeds. As soon as I saw that, I thought that's the essence, isn't it? Because reeds get flattened by the flood. Don't you guys wish you had a flood? But then when the water recedes, the reeds come back, whereas the trees get washed out of their roots and away. And I think it's about, resilience is about hanging on to the most important qualities of our life that become the core of our future. The quality of life, meaning, values, relationships, community. These cannot be replaced. They are the essence. that's what we need to focus on. We need to go into bricks and mortar and finances and all the rest of it, and agronomy and fences, but you must put first the quality of life and relationships, because it's no good having a new house and a farm and your marriage is broken down, or your children are off the rails, or your health's broken down. And so therefore it's so important that the relationships are preserved, the social fabric is preserved, and we can build everything on that. And that means putting an equal focus on those things to the practical issues. And finally, we come to this set of contributors to resilience that come out of the research into resilience. Moral compass, flexible element. I won't go through them all, you can read them, because actually when you think of what's going on in the cleavage planes, in the fusion going into cleavage planes, you've got a destructive process, which means you've got a choice between resilience or desilience as these negative processes open up to an ongoing process that degrades the quality of people's lives over this period. And so this is what I think the first 6 to 9 to 12 months is about after disasters. With droughts, it's ongoing, and so it's a matter of actually trying to prioritize all these things as just the whole system slowly gets worse and worse. Look, I'll stop there and see if anyone's got any questions.
Thanks, Rob. That was very interesting. There are a few questions. I'd just like to say there's a very interesting line of discussion in the chat box, in the Zoom chat box, which we'll try and save somehow. Not exactly sure how that works, but people might find that interesting. As Rob might have to go, just a couple of questions have come through repeatedly. What is the impact of isolation due to COVID-19? Presumably this will make communities very debonded.
Yes, thank you for that. I've been asked a question a lot. If you think about it, isolation is a sort of a low-grade debonding, isn't it? It's not a complete debonding, but it's a let's say degrading of the bonds, erosion of the bonds, and we can keep in touch electronically. But what we lose electronically is a lot of the implicit communication, the you know, the body language. I'm trying to use my hands. You probably can't see them, but you know, the tone of voice and so on. A lot of these things reduce that amount of communication, and we have to set up a communicational event and so on, so we don't have that spontaneous contact we have and see someone in the street. So I think that makes all of these processes much harder. We probably have to be more thoughtful as to how we design webinars and making sure people have access to it. And it's going to restrict it enormously. Actually, as one of my young clients said to me, a young adult who's you know, working on his thesis at university, after a couple of weeks in this, he came along one day and said, or came online one day and said, I understand now why solitary confinement is a serious punishment. He's of course at home in his flat by himself, but supposedly writing up his thesis. So I think it's very important that people retain self-awareness. And there's one other point I'd make on this, and that is that what I notice is that this isolation process seems to degrade a person's sense of self in a subtle sort of way. I think we preserve our sense of our value and our quality and who we are from a lot of those interactions. You know, you're walking down the street and someone waves to you across the road and says, "G'day, Rob, how you going?" And I realise I must be a nice person, mustn't I? If I have an underlying bad mood and I get that wave, I thought I was miserable, no hoper, but actually somebody thinks I'm all right, and you get a few of those, and by the end of the day, you're feeling better. It's boosting my identity. Well, if I'm at home and no one rings me up, I just go, you know, down and down. So I think it's a funny thing that some people feel threatened in their identities, and this is really an issue between the introverts, the people who take the meaning of their lives from within themselves. They're much more liable to be, you know, okay. Well, you know, some people are saying, I love this lockdown for a bit of peace and quiet at last, nobody bothering me. And then the extroverts who, you know, interact with everybody, actually feel more and more restless and feel they're going crazy. I need to talk to someone. And what I notice is in organizations, there's a conflict between the introverts and the extroverts. The introverts are working at home saying, oh, at last I can get on with my work and get a bit done. And the extroverts are sending them emails all the time with trivia and jokes and annoying them because they want some interaction. Well, I get interaction, all right, but not the interaction they want. And so you get these tensions growing. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's happening in families. But I think the underlying thing is we actually maintain our sense of who we are from spontaneous communications. In other words, communication I don't ask for. It comes to me spontaneously by the interactions I have. And so I think one thing we can do is just create more opportunities where we actually initiate communication and tell people what we think of them, or just don't tell them, but just treat them as though they're interesting. So that'd be, you know, something that hopefully it's going to start abating. But I think if it were to keep going, we're probably going to need to be more deliberate about this sort of thing.
Okay, there's some other questions there which we will deal with at the end. We're running about 15 minutes late, and I know our other speakers have got commitments as well. So thanks, Rob. We'll ask these questions at the end if you're still around.
I'll probably have to tune out in about 5 minutes, unfortunately, for this today, but
all right.
I'll be able to say the distance for the next lot.
No, well, that's all right. Well, people might like to tune in to the following forums next Tuesday to get some questions as well. Just, given that you are going, then there's just one that I'm not entirely certain about what it means, but somebody has asked, is the anger, etc., that comes from destructive differentiation also similar to lateral violence? I have no idea what lateral violence is, but anyway.
Yeah, I think that's violence within the social system, rather than to the, you know, to the government, to the breakdown. Yeah, I think you could say that's a concept. It's coming from a different sort of frame of reference, but I think that's the point at which the connections between people within social systems leads to friction and violence. Yes, that'd be another way of talking about it. That's there in society anyway. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Rob.